deforestation, a major cause of habitat obliteration. Trees make oxygen that we need to breathe. No more trees means no more me. Time to stop burning those fossil fuels if we don't want to be fossils too. Burning fuel causes air pollution. It's time to embrace a greener solution. Large-scale farming plays a big part. Billions of cows means a whole lot of farts. We need change, it has to be drastic. Cut the production of single-use plastic. 3 million years human evolution. 200 years industrial pollution. One last chance for a green revolution. It's time to wise up, get our act together. This is so much more than changes in the weather. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. It's time to wise up, get our act together. This is so much more than changes in the weather. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. The time is now. Oh, 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 oh. The time is now. Oh, 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 oh. The time is now. Oh, 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 oh. The time is now.
The time is now. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for most generously spending your lunch hour with us. Believe me, you'll be truly rewarded. My name is Tara Shishtarian, a South Asian guest settler, and I am privileged to be your MC, coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Hakamilam and Squamish-speaking peoples, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Coquitlam nations here in Burnaby. I also acknowledge that we are coming from different unceded ancestral territories and treaty lands across Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, and maybe beyond those borders as well. Again, a very warm welcome to the West Coast Climate Action Network's Lunch and Learn webinar with Eriel Tchekwie Deranger. Many apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly. And before we begin, just to start us in a good way, as I know my ancestors behind me on the wall are looking down, I would like to wish you a very happy Festival of Colors, Happy Holi, and may all the joys and colors and warmth and happiness be with you. So before we proceed, just a little bit about ourselves. WeCan is an active volunteer-run network of 293 climate action groups across British Columbia, all of which share our feeling of deep urgency and reality of the climate crisis. Our determined hope is that together we can make a difference and build a better world. So today we are honored to welcome Eriel Tchekwie Deranger, who was welcomed into the Climate Breakthrough Award Program in 2024 with a $4 million grant to fulfill her project. Eriel is a Dene member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation and the mother of 2. She is a determined and persistent Indigenous rights and climate activist. She is the co-founder and executive director of Indigenous Climate Action. In 2011, she became the communications coordinator for the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, organizing protests against the expansion of the Athabasca oil sands. Sorry for that. She was a founder of the annual Tar Sands Healing Walk, a cathartic experience. If you have seen videos of the walk, it shows not only grief, but the deep care and connection of Indigenous peoples to their land. She has many years of experience working with environmental organizations and frontline Indigenous knowledge holders, water protectors, and land defenders across Turtle Island. She is also an active member of the UN Indigenous Peoples Caucus and is sought after globally as a climate leader on climate change and Indigenous rights. Eriel wants to use her Climate Breakthrough Award to launch a globally coordinated effort that will allow for the effective participation by Indigenous peoples all around the world in bringing forward climate solutions. Please extend a big welcome to Eriel, and I'm so sorry for the phone ringing. Many apologies. Over to you, Eriel.
Masi Cho, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And iklanete, dene sotlaneta, Eriel Tchekwie Deranger Betsy ni Hasli. So my name again is Eriel Tchekwie Deranger, and my name in my traditional language, which is Dene or Dene Sotlane, it means Thunder Woman. And my last name, which is Deranger, comes from the French missionaries that gave a bunch of people in my community French last names that sounded similar to our existing names. And at the time, my great grandfather's name would have been Deskelne. And they picked Deranger because it sounded similar. Deskelne meant river keeper, and Deranger in French means to disturb. So my name is Thunder Woman to Disturb. And I find it kind of funny and fitting when I share that little bit of information. I think I just wanted to start before I jump into some slides to just lay a little bit of context as to what the Climate Breakthrough Award is and really what I'm planning to do, because the slides get into the more of the political theory. First off, in December, it was just announced this past December that I was a recipient of the Climate Breakthrough Award. And this prestigious program provides individuals with substantial, flexible, non-directive, multi-year support to develop, launch, and scale our boldest new work with potential to address the climate crisis. And so with this investment from Climate Breakthrough and the ongoing support of Indigenous Climate Action, the organization I founded in 2015, and where I continue to serve as the executive director, I'm hoping to explore strategic ways to support the collective work of Indigenous communities in the fight for climate justice and the advancement and implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples as outlined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. And together, we will uplift Indigenous liberation and land back as real solutions to the climate crisis. I am initiating this project by bringing together a global Indigenous Advisory Council that is composed of representatives from all 7 socio-cultural regions of the world, where we will come together to develop a work plan, key goals and objectives of how we will achieve these lofty goals, and really address how Indigenous solutions are not just some romanticized, idealistic solutions framework, but how they have real substantial impacts on mitigating and reducing emissions, as well as bringing forward bold new solutions and platforms for what we consider viable solutions to addressing the climate crisis and building new frameworks for future generations. And I really just wanted to share that as that context, because I think it's really important that we understand that this grant and award is building off of the work that I have done historically over the last 20 some years, working alongside, and that introduction was kind of a trip down memory lane of really looking at all of the different things that I have been a part of. And it's been such an incredible journey, but I really love to bring it back to where I come from. So a lot of my presentation, I just really want to walk you through who I am. So as was stated, I am a Dene Sotlane or Dene person who is a registered member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. My family's traditional trap line actually extended into northern Saskatchewan into a region called N22, or a territory near Uranium City. However, the year that I was born in 1979, our trapline was appropriated from our family to usher in uranium mining exploration in our traditional territories, and we became expelled, or we were forced out of our territory by armed security of a uranium mining company named El Dorado. Despite this, my parents ensured that we had a deep understanding of who we were as both Indigenous peoples, but more importantly, as Dene people. We spent a lot of our time on the land, living in a canvas tent in the bush in the summers, hauling our water, cooking over fires, hunting, fishing, and trapping, putting out nets, and really knowing what it meant to be in deep relationship with the land and what it meant to be Dene. And Dene, when you break down those core words, that word into its core principles, it means to flow from the land. My people come from what is known as the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is one of the last remaining inland freshwater deltas in the world, and houses much biodiversity, so much so that parts of it have been classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Wood Buffalo National Park. These territories are critical and essential to climate stabilization, but more importantly to me as an individual, to the sustainability and longevity of my cultural heritage, identities, and who we are as Dene and Dene-Sotlene people. Just another picture from my childhood with my family. I'm the little one in the front in the stroller down there. This is our family on the Powwow Trail. This is a map of the Treaty 8 territories. The Treaty 8 was signed in 1899. And I currently reside in the Treaty 6 territories just outside of Amiskwaciwâskahikan, also known as Edmonton, in the Enoch Cree Nations territory. And really recognizing that Indigenous peoples exist and our territories are expansive, and who we are and where we come from is not static to one place, and that we tend to move around and have relations in all of the different territories. So just really want to acknowledge where I am today. I think it's also important for the context of this discussion around like why I'm doing what I'm doing is really rooted in my own personal experiences. And we often think of so-called Canada as either a map of provinces and territories, Quebec, British Columbia, like all of the territories. And if we go a little bit deeper, some know and understand the numbered treaties of Canada, numbers 1 through 11. But sometimes that's where things start to stop. And people don't understand that we had something called pre-Confederation treaties as well as post-Confederation treaties that help determine how these lands are shared and managed by both settlers and the original inhabitants, which are the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of this territory. And I think it should be also known that there is still much tracts of land in this country that have not had treaties signed and agreements for the management, and yet we still exist under paternal rule. Now, these treaties are often looked at as ways that we are going to share the land. However, when it comes down to the ways in which the colonial government and or the crown has decided to manage these lands and territories, is that we don't have the rights over these vast tracts, including Treaty 8, where I come from. It has been reduced to a 0.2% control of lands in First Nations hands and territories. The other 99.8% still remains under the jurisdiction of the Crown. We have been essentially, those treaties were not upheld, and instead they said you only actually have control over your reserve lands. This was one of the first parts where treaty was truly breached, when they made us sign these treaties with this assumption that we were going to share the land, co-manage, when in actuality, they had no intentions of doing so. This map was created by the late Arthur Manuel, who has done who wrote incredible work on economics and Indigenous rights in this country, that talked about this being one of the primary drivers for the continued disenfranchisement and from economic systems and power and control in this country, and it needs to be recognized. Now, I don't know what happened. I can't move my slides. There we go. So essentially, really, really recognizing that Canada is built on the foundations of stolen lands and territories. And the stolen lands were not just stolen and celebrated, but they actually started to move towards heavy extractivism from the very onset of settler colonialism, starting largely with the fur trade, morphing secondarily into the development of agriculture and fishing industries, which those resources were then extracted and exported to support colonial empires, predominantly in Europe during first settlement. This type of extractivism and utilization of the lands and territories was predicated from white supremacist ideologies founded in things like doctrines of discovery, the papal bull, but really the ideology that this was man's dominion and we had man's dominion over nature, and it was ours for the taking to exploit, which is very counterintuitive to the interconnections and the relationships that Indigenous peoples had pre-contact. And this exploitation and overdevelopment of our lands and territories led to the degradation of our own qualities of life, both culturally, spiritually, and physically. And where are we now? As we've seen that development in that really great video that was shared, we talked about 200 years of industrialization. In the last half of the industrialization of the West or North America, we saw massive movements towards the industrialization for the development of fossil fuels and oil and gas, which exacerbated the already existing challenges of the overdevelopment through agriculture, fishing, and fur trade industry on the lives of Indigenous communities, and really ushering in an era of environmental racism that led to contamination and degradation of vast tracts of ecosystems in the territories of so-called Canada. All of this, we often think about, fossil fuel development, climate change. These are very key things that are happening. But when we think about climate change from a really, in my opinion, reductionist frameworks, we tend to just talk about global temperatures and rising GHG emissions. And we focus on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and we get really caught up on how do we reduce the emissions. But the reality is that the climate crisis is a polycrisis. It is about the fact that we are out of balance with our relationships with the natural world, and that in order to address the climate crisis, we must actually begin to restore our relationships with Mother Earth and with each other to address the imbalance in all aspects of our lives, and not simply reduce the carbon crisis to a temperature and GHG crisis, because that puts it in a reductionist framework. The reality is that when we only look at our lands and territories as resources to be extracted, rather than the relations and the kin to the Indigenous nations that lived here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years prior to colonization, we also invisibilize the knowledge systems and the solutions frameworks that come with these people. I challenge all people in these conversations to reconsider how they view the territories that they exist and live on outside of these colonial constructs of either treaty territories or colonial borders of provinces and territories, and start to reconsider thinking about the nations that existed in these areas pre-contact. So what has happened? This is an industrial sectors map from 2015. This is old and outdated. Talk about what happens when we disconnect ourselves from the natural world, we can justify the expansion and development of industrial sectors to increase our GDP and economics of the local regions, predominantly for political and economic power. And we can create these entire sectors that are going to wipe out and obliterate the environmental landscapes of these territories. You can see that the policies predominantly in Alberta have led to massive scale development, and this is the territory where I come from, and even further to the industrial sectors, which correlate very closely to the systems that we've, to the industrial sectors. We can also see that the anthropogenic footprint matches the settlements that are predominantly close to the borders, but also we can see where those sectors are. Like if you look in northern Quebec, that's not human populations, but rather it is industrial sectors in the mining and quarrying and oil and gas. And so we really have to think about how the human impacts and the industrialization has led to the degradation. And it's less about human settlement, but rather the ideological perspectives that the land is ours for the taking, and to dominate and to destroy and contaminate, and to support the concepts of empire and colonial systems ongoing. So for myself, when I think about climate change, I actually try to expand the drivers of the crisis beyond just GHGs and fossil fuels, to look at what are those systems that allow those things to create: colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and extractivism. These are the root causes of climate change that allow and justify the expansion of the industrial sector that is degrading both our ecosystems and producing rising GHGs annually. And we think of Canada as this utopian, or this very environmentally responsible country, but the reality is that is not the case. Even our liberal government that has been applauded for taking progressive action on the climate crisis have said things like this. No country would find 173 barrels of oil and just leave them there. First Nations will protest, but Trans Mountain Pipeline's a done deal, a pipeline that was bought and paid for by the Liberal government with taxpayers' dollars. And additionally, Indigenous peoples can't veto pipelines, meaning that we're not going to uphold the fundamental rights of communities to say no to projects. And all of this is to continue to expand our industrial resources, predominantly in the country, in the Alberta oil sands, where we have seen breakneck speeds of the expansion of this industry that doesn't just create oil, but is creating massive emissions that are very they're not reporting properly. They have poor management of the industry itself, and they're continue to expand year after year, even despite the growing alarm bells for the climate crisis. And we have a serious problem on our hands because these projects are not creating massive amounts of emissions and growing at breakneck speeds, but they are proposing massive pipeline routes that continue to pop up and disappear. They call zombie pipeline in the United States, the KXL. We have zombie pipelines to the East Coast under Line 5, Line 9, Trans Mountain, Enbridge. They're just trying to continue to expand the routes of these projects that go far beyond just the impacts at the extraction zone. And, the late Dr. Schindler said there's nothing on this planet that compares with the destruction. I'm sharing this as a microcosm of what happens when we allow ourselves to justify the destruction of the environmental landscapes that we rely on, not just for equalizing the atmospheric particles in the atmosphere, but also to rely on to stabilize our overall well-being. Particularly as Indigenous peoples, these areas are critical to our cultural survival. And these projects are not just creating emissions. They're not just destroying and cutting down massive amounts of ecosystem. They're further compounding those through the contamination and the degradation of water systems that are also critical for stabilizing the atmosphere. And all of this leads to human rights abuses, and particularly to the abuses of Indigenous peoples' rights in downstream or close to extraction zones. Again, I'm sharing this not because I think that the tar sands is the issue we should be talking about, but this is an example of what happens when we allow ourselves to believe that this is okay, that this is progress, and that Indigenous peoples are just simply the sacrifices or the obstacles to the progress for continued economic and political power. Alice Rigney, who is a very well-respected elder in my community, says that they don't care about us. They come into our communities, we go to meetings with them, and they offer us trinkets, just like when treaty was signed. Instead of beads, now it's mugs with their name on it. This is what we have. This is neo-colonialism. But what I think needs to be understood is, why is protecting Indigenous rights a solutions framework and pathway forward? Globally, it has been estimated that Indigenous lands and other protected areas created to safeguard land rights, Indigenous livelihoods, biodiversity, and others contains more than 312 billion tons of carbon, meaning that Indigenous lands and territories are sequestering carbon at an exponential rate that's necessary for climate stabilization. So protecting Indigenous rights and lands and territories and allowing Indigenous peoples to determine what happens with those lands means safeguarding the carbon sequestration values of those lands and territories. So again, in the context of Canada, if you want to look at this, we have massive organic carbon masses throughout our country. And there's lots of people talking about what we're doing with this. There's now new emerging discussions on carbon trading, which is a whole other problematic area that I can't even begin to touch on in this conversation. But we're starting to look at the lands like this now. So we're not looking necessarily always at just the resources, but now we're looking at carbon. I remind you that these aren't simply resources to be traded and commodified, but these are the lifelines and the territories of massive amounts of Indigenous peoples. In this country, we're talking about close to 4 million Indigenous peoples in this country, and we have to recognize the rights that are deeply entrenched under treaty, under our Canadian Constitution, and that are internationally affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But again, I shared all of that because I want to demonstrate that Indigenous peoples don't just exist in one place. We exist globally. There are currently close to 600 million Indigenous peoples worldwide, representing 6% of the global population. What's really interesting is that our recognized lands and territories constitute at least 28% of the global land surface, including unique ecosystems and vital biodiversity. So they also are safeguarding the world's languages. There are roughly about 6,000 world languages worldwide. And of those 6,000, I believe that something like 5,500 or close to are represented by Indigenous languages globally. And these languages provide pathways to understanding the relationships with the ecosystems because they come often from relationships with the lands. The words in Indigenous languages are not simple words, but they are wrapped up in relationships with the ecosystems and the places that we come from. So much so that in most Indigenous languages, there's no word for the environment as a separate entity because it is a part of the everyday things that we do. It is impossible. There's not even words for climate change because there's not a way to describe the climate or the environment as something separate from who we are. And I think that there is so much value in sharing the story I did about Canada because this is something that is happening globally. The reality is that European empires have proliferated across the entire globe with the same mentality of expansion for resources through the idea of pursuing empires that are built off of trading and commodifying goods to create economies that are predicated on systems of infinite growth, which is just absolutely not the case. So my demonstration of what I've experienced has led me to understand that this is a global problem and a global opportunity. And so some people said, okay, so what are the Indigenous people even actually doing? Like, are they actually doing anything? Like, what are they actually doing to actually address the crisis and create meaningful solutions frameworks? And I think, you know, we tend to lean heavily as Indigenous peoples globally, this is globally, on protest, direct action, civil disobedience, because the laws that have been created by the colonial systems are there to support colonial power, not our power. So civil disobedience tends to be one of the tracks that we use. But it's all based on the fact that when you are destroying the lands and territories, you are destroying the Indigenous peoples themselves. And unfortunately, one of the main issues for advancing Indigenous solutions is because we are not recognized as sovereign entities and nations, we don't have the same leverage to enter into these spaces to negotiate at the tables with states. We are relegated to the sidelines and the hallways of these fora that are negotiating the policies, legislation, frameworks, targets for reducing emissions, and what we need to do to combat the climate crisis, while Indigenous peoples across the entire region have been caught up in this struggle since first contact of trying to move us away from the destruction of the natural world to restoring our relationships. And so over the last, the first COP I went to was COP 15. So we're now up to COP 30. So there's 15 years of participation in these spaces. And we have had to utilize protest. We have had to utilize nonviolent direct action to have our voices heard over and over and over again. And why? Why do we do that though? What's the point of doing that? Well, first off, we have internationally affirmed rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was passed in 2007 that says that we have the right to our own representatives in decision-making that would affect our rights. And we are supposed to be able to do that ourselves. But instead they say, oh, we'll consult with you. We'll consult with you. One of the foundational pillars of the UN DEC is free, prior, informed consent, FPIC. As it's sort of known as. But what happens is in Canada and in many other countries, they don't want consent to be actually given. They've reduced consent simply to consultation. Additionally, they're focused wholly on, did we achieve consultation and or consent in some cases, and they do not actually hold or value or uphold their responsibilities to the free of coercion, manipulation, intimidation prior with enough time to be able to digest and receive that information and all of the best available information, not just the information that's going to allow the government to have their or the corporations their interests upheld. And so there's no upholding of what I refer to as the models of FPI. And we are too heavily focused on consent, and we are and reducing consent to consultation and not allowing our people to determine who we are by our own representatives and our own positions. What's really frustrating is that time and time again with consultations and the consultations that ICA did starting in 2016 is that we need to have a more robust and rigorous process to adequately include Indigenous peoples in the development of any and all measures to understand climate change, to reduce or mitigate climate change, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Without this, we are going to miss key metrics in understanding the impacts of climate change on a whole, from a justice framework of not just looking at did the water levels rise, did the temperatures change, but how did that impact the whole being and the cultural survivals? Spiritually, mentally, physically, and culturally, we need to be examining the impacts of climate change. And again, on the other side, what are the solutions frameworks that can come out of Indigenous knowledge systems and models? So this is where we start to get now, because we're at a point where in the international spaces, they're like, okay, yes, we get it. Indigenous peoples have knowledge, Indigenous peoples have rights. So can you tell us, like, what does that actually even substantively mean? How are your rights impacting mitigations to climate? How is knowledge creating solutions frameworks? And this is an area that is actually really like we're just in the infancy of unpacking how Indigenous solutions and knowledge can actually be utilized and replicated at a scale that it becomes an impact. But I need to start first and foremost that Indigenous peoples, we are our own experts. We have people that have intergenerational knowledge around ecosystems. We have hydrologists, ecologists, conservationists, botanists that exist in our communities through the transmission of Indigenous knowledge over centuries. We don't need to have people to come in to validate our knowledge systems, but we do want to work with Western systems and science, and we don't want to say we don't want them there, but we have just as much valuable information. It's just not held in the same metrics of empirical science and data collection. And it has been recognized that Indigenous peoples react and interpret the impacts of climate change in creative ways, often drawing on traditional knowledge and the merging of other technologies to find solutions that society at large can replicate to counter pending changes. But what does that actually amount to? Well, the one thing that I think is missing from this is the fact that Indigenous land defense is actually climate mitigation. We talk about Indigenous knowledge, we talk about all of these things, but at the end of the day, why are we protesting? Why are we continuing to fight this if we can't just sit to the table and create policy? Well, we can't create policy when there's active abuses and active destruction of our lands and territories. And many of these projects are actually creating and exacerbating the global climate crisis through massive amounts of emission and the destruction of critical ecosystems. This report, commissioned by the Indigenous Environmental Network, Oil Change International, and Indigenous Climate Action in 2019, I want to say, maybe 2020. I'd have to look. I just don't remember right now. It might be there. I just can't see it because my camera's in the way. Looked at sort of the high level Indigenous resistance against extractivism in just Turtle Island over the course of, I believe, 20 years. And so this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. But Indigenous resistance, if you take all the projects that are being actively resisted and or stopped, it adds up to 1.8 billion metric tons of CO2, or roughly 28% of the size of 2019 US and Canadian pollution is being mitigated by Indigenous land defense. Secondarily, we have to understand that why is this critically important that land defense is also in there? Because the reality is Indigenous peoples continue to suffer disproportionately high levels of land insecurity, which contributes to social location and violence while defending our traditional lands. And we make up 15% of the world's poorest people, despite only representing 6% of the global population. Land defense becomes a critical avenue, just in the same way that we've used NVDA and nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience in the international fora. It is also often the only avenue of recourse for Indigenous peoples to take. And instead of being applauded for protecting ecosystems, we are criminalized. Also, one of the really cool emerging things is that Indigenous peoples are starting to lead the way in a just transition by taking our Indigenous knowledge systems and our relationships with the land in developing what are considered localized solutions to energy deserts in the past, creating energy sovereignty through the utilization of technologies like solar and wind and very small scale hydro, to looking at how they can develop ecosystems with food security and to support food sovereignty. We are seeing a just transition being ushered by Indigenous peoples. And you can read more about this in the Just Transition Guide that was created with Sacred Earth Solar, Indigenous Climate Action, David Suzuki Foundation, and People for the Power to the People and real world. Oh my God, I can't say real world media. It's like a tongue twister to me. But the reality is that just transition and challenging the model of what just transition is from an Indigenous perspective forces us to have a more holistic version of what it is and not reducing, again, like the climate crisis, to a reductionist framework, but expanding it into the whole well-being of communities, not just talking about transition for jobs and energy, but transition of the entire well-being of our ideologies of how we manage our lands and territories to usher in economic, food security, language revitalization, cultural revitalization into our systems. And I just wanted to also name that the international community is understanding and sort of providing lip service to saying that Indigenous rights and sovereignty needs to be recognized in national climate policies globally. However, what we're finding, and this report can also be found online, is that most of these countries are failing to abide by their obligations as set out in the international law, both in the context of climate change and beyond, not just missing their targets for their international commitments to reduction of emissions, but their international commitments for the integration of Indigenous rights and sovereignty into national climate policies. So we have these like two sides where people are saying, yeah, Indigenous peoples, lots of value. We really love you. Congratulations, come stand on this floor, like platform, but giving us no resources, no power, and no decision-making authority over our lands and territories, and simply providing lip service as opposed to substantive avenues for advancing our solutions frameworks. So, decolonizing climate policy in Canada is an initiative of ICA, which you can look at more, but is the model for what I'm thinking of for this international initiative with Climate Breakthrough. How do we take these ideas that are being sort of experimented at the national levels and expand them beyond? How do we start talking about how the solutions frameworks being prescribed by state governments continue to have risks and threats to Indigenous peoples, including things like nature-based solutions and carbon markets? And how do we really uphold Indigenous knowledge that Indigenous or local communities accumulate over generations of living in a particular environment to be the foundations for determining the metrics of measuring the impacts of climate change and measuring the success of climate solutions? And I always like to share this one little story on the power of Indigenous knowledge from my own community, not in a climate solution wholly, but a little bit indirectly. In 2000 and between 2010 and 2012, the Alberta government was working on something called the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, looking at surface water quantity and quality. They brought in external hydrologists, conservationists, biologists, all the things to come and study the region and meeting with all of the stakeholders. Largely industry had huge stake in the game on the water issues in the region because of the Alberta tar sands. And they worked to find what they would then coin as the ecological base flow. What was the base flow that would be necessary to protect the river system and meet the needs of all of the stakeholders? And so they presented this to our community and communities as a whole in the region to be like, okay, so we did this, we developed this ecological base flow. It's based off of all the best available science. And they said, do you approve? Do you agree with this? And our knowledge holders in the community said, well, I don't know what any of this means. I don't know what 250 millimeters per second mean in the river. Make that real. And so they did. We took some time to basically qualify that through like actually taking them in the water, showing them what the depth of the river would be, if the flow rate was at the ecological base flow. And sure enough, they could travel to all of the critical points in our lands and territories. And it seemed fine until one of our knowledge holders said, well, this is great. I mean, we can travel everywhere in our boat, but what happens if I get one or two moose and I put it in my boat? Am I going to still be able to travel and traverse all of the pinch points? And it turns out he couldn't. It turns out that when you look at the actual metrics for utilization and relationship with the ecosystems, and not just simply what the ecosystem needs to survive without human interaction, it changed. It changed so much that it almost doubled what would be necessary for an ecological base flow that included human usage of these lands and territories. This is how Indigenous knowledge systems have the potential to impact and strengthen policies for the management of lands and territories, as well as how we look at solutions frameworks that are going to have longer term impacts, not just to reducing our GHG emissions, but for ensuring the longevity of human interactions and relationships with the natural world. I really like to show this as well because there's this mythos that's often perpetrated in a lot of these spaces that before colonization, Indigenous peoples just followed the buffalo on the land and they didn't know what they didn't do anything. They're just like nomadic people. But the reality is we had major trade routes and economic systems that expanded all the way from Alaska into South America. That economy and like commerce and economic systems, governance, trades, they all existed pre-contact. And innovation and technology also didn't come with settler expansion into North America. That Indigenous peoples of the Americas are responsible for the innovation of things like the syringe, rubber, suspension bridges, aspirin, the baby bottle nipple, medical procedures for reducing pressure on the brain, education models, governance models, all come from the innovations and technologies of Indigenous peoples that existed in these lands and territories for thousands and thousands of years before contact. We were not simply savages and nomadic people that lived on the lands, but we had sophisticated systems of both commerce, innovation, and governance that allowed us to be in harmony with the natural world and not sort of take us to this idea of man's dominion over nature, but looked at our relationships and responsibilities. And so we're now seeing Indigenous peoples taking charge of our lands and territories, using Indigenous knowledge holders to usher in ways in which we want to manage our lands and territories, monitor them, and really develop economic systems that work for us, energy systems that work for us, taking communities like Fort Chipewyan that was a diesel, like heated and powered by diesel energy, and building the largest off-grid solar farm for energy sovereignty. We're talking about communities taking Indigenous knowledge holders and innovation and technology and trying to create food security and food sovereignty in our communities that are being degraded by industry. We're seeing our communities advance solutions that we desperately need in order to move the needle on progress for climate justice that have historically been left out of the conversations. I love to share this video. It is about 3 minutes. So I'm going to share this video, and this is from COP26 in Madrid. And it's from the climate march that happens during the COP gatherings, the Conference of the Party gatherings under the UNFCCC. And it's just one of the most powerful articulations that always makes me emotional. I don't know why it's not playing. Oh. Sorry. There we go.
We are one with the earth, with the sky, with the sea, with the sun. We are one. For Indigenous people, Unuhit, the notion that we are one is a simple truth that has guided our life in ways that has sustained us since the beginning of time. We value the sacred knowledge of the earth that has been passed down to us through the generations, knowledge that can bring us the healing the world so desperately needs in this time. As we face the most critical challenge of our time, climate change, we urge all peoples to shift their relationships with the earth and with each other.
As Indigenous youth, we are in the front lines of climate change, and we are also in the front lines of fighting it. Indigenous rights are imperative to climate justice because climate change is the result of colonialism. My ancestors were the original climate activists, beginning at first contact with our resistance to the desecration of our sacred lands and sacred waters. For hundreds of years since colonization, we have been saying that this way, this colonial way of relating to our lands from a point of extraction, from a point of taking without reciprocity, without giving back, is flawed, and it will drive us to destruction. And now we are on the precipice of global collapse. We as Indigenous youth are calling on global. We've sacrificed everything for our lands. We've fought, we have died, we have had our children taken away from our homes because of these lands. And we are calling you to fulfill your responsibilities. Because it's not just about protecting our livelihoods, it's about the livelihoods of your children and your future generations, and our ability to live on this sacred land.
Y actualmente hay 33,000 personas que están en riesgo de perderlo todo por el levantamiento del nivel del mar. Nosotros no consumimos combustibles fósiles y a pesar de ello somos los que más vamos a sufrir. Somos los que más sufrimos por el cambio climático. Estamos a punto de perder nuestra lengua, nuestra tierra, nuestra tradición, por la forma en la que viven en las ciudades. Así que tenemos que dejar estas palabras vacías, estas palabras de los gobernantes que no están haciendo nada, porque necesitamos acción ya. Necesitamos acción ya por las mujeres, por los niños, por la comunidad LGBT, por todos, por los pueblos indígenas.
Woo! That video always makes me emotional, no matter how many times I've watched it. I think that one of the things I really want to articulate is that I have been working in international forums and spaces since I was in my early 20s, and I'm now in my late 40s. And one of the things that I've learned is when I first started going as a young person, I was blown away that the Indigenous experience was almost like word for word exactly the same across the globe. Our cultures and our languages and our landscapes and biomes might have been different, but the experience of colonial oppression, subjugation, and disenfranchisement from our own lands and territories and governance over our people was the same. Even the stories of children being removed from homes, the same, over and over again. And also the story that was also the same was the love and the continued perseverance of wanting to protect our lands and our territories forever for our future generations also rang true. And so while we are living in a world that recognizes Indigenous peoples, we have to face the fact that colonization is not something that happened. It is an ongoing process, shaping both the structures and the quality of relationships between settlers and Indigenous peoples globally. If we are going to create a climate justice movement that is actually rooted in true justice, then we need to address and eliminate colonial harms and colonial power and move towards a decolonial future that allows us to build solutions that are built for everyone, including our non-human kin and relatives in the natural world. That is what my hope is to do with this project, is to bring that global community together, to share our lived experiences, and to build strategies to advance us beyond the hallways and relegations to protest, to move towards substantive power and control as sovereign nations that have the power to drive solutions that the whole world can benefit from as we merge our worlds together for a decolonial future. Thank you, Masicho.
Masicho, Eriel, that was so powerful. I can't tell you. You're a climate activist, warrior woman, knowledge keeper. I don't know, there's so many adjectives to you. Now I'd like to just throw it over to our audience. If you have a question or a comment, please feel free to unmute yourselves and put up your electronic hand so I can see, I can just ask you to unmute yourself.
So Eriel, thanks so much for that. How is it going with your global council of advisors from around the world? How many people have you got? Have you met yet? What challenges are you finding? Do you have to have translators? How's it all going? It's such a big thing, right?
That is a very good question. So we actually just had our first meeting Tuesday with the council. The council is going to be comprised of about 16 individuals with a minimum of 2 representatives from the 7 sociocultural regions of the world. So those regions are, oh my God, I'm going to get it wrong if I don't look at my notes, but it's Latin America and Caribbean, North America, Asia, Russia, Europe, Africa, and the Pacific.
Yeah,
and the Pacific, yeah. So those are the 7 regions of the world, and we have a meeting to plan to come together in early May, to really develop the work plan in outlining the goals and real tangible deliverables for this project over the next 3 to 4 years in May. So that is where we're really going to get into the weeds of like, what can we actually achieve? What can we do with the 4 million, and what do we actually need as far as expanding those resources to have real impact? 4 million seems like a lot of money, but when you talk about it on a global scale, it's like literally, it's like pennies. The impact that can actually happen with 4 million is very, very, very low. As far as your question on translation, I am working really closely with folks that have been in the international space that have working knowledge of English, but do have plans to have translated materials into the sort of the standardized, recognized UN languages plus Portuguese, because for some reason Portuguese isn't a recognized UN language. And so we are going to be providing materials in all of those languages into the future.
Now, are you meeting in Canada, or are you going to New Zealand or somewhere exotic?
We are meeting in New Zealand for the first meeting. We had a representative of the Global Council offer hosting in a marae, which is a traditional ceremonial house of the Maori people, and really excited to be able to go and visit another territory. Again, as a global project, the spaces that we'll meet will probably change to offer experiences in all of the different Indigenous territories.
Well, we wish you the best of luck for that. Not luck, but the power of the universe behind you. That's what we wish.
Thank you.
Douglas, would you like to ask your question? Thanks.
Thank you, Eriel. I'm still a bit tearful after watching your video. And I'm proud of you. You're following in the footsteps of Arthur Manuel, whose books I read. I'm wondering if you could talk about something that's a little bit challenging, and that is the co-opting of Indigenous people by industry and colonialism, and whether they've just been like trapped.
That is that's like a whole other hour-long lecture, if I'm going to be honest, but it is a real issue. I think that the reality is that Indigenous peoples still face mounting pressures and manipulation and overlapping political and economic interests seeking to either protect nature or exploit nature within Indigenous lands and territories. And like the co-optation is a real thing. Right now, in the climate movement, we often hear things like greenwashing all the time. But what we are now experiencing with the increased recognition of the value of Indigenous peoples is something that is now being coined as redwashing. So essentially putting Indigenous peoples on the stage and getting them to essentially state that this project is great, or we're working in partnerships and Indigenous peoples benefit from these industries without actually having done the true due diligence. And it's also really impossible to do that when we haven't addressed the colonial empire's continued colonial practices to completely disenfranchise Indigenous nations and disrespect the sovereignty and self-determination. So it truly is a problem right now, and it's across all the board, like whether those are like so-called sustainable renewable energy solutions or the continuation of the expansion of the fossil fuel and dirty energy sectors. So it's really challenging. And I often refer to an interesting quote from Jack Forbes, who was an Indigenous scholar from the United States. He wrote a book in the 70s called Columbus and Other Cannibals. And in the book, he stated that he equated colonialism as a form of cannibalism, because when you colonize the territories, you're actually and destroying them, you're literally destroying yourself. And so it's a form of cannibalism. But what he said is that this like colonialism is a disease of the mind, and it's similar to an Algonquin deity called the Witigo, and that people are suffering from the Witigo disease. It's the disease of the mind to consume the natural world and everything around you to amass power. But he wrote a very provocative part of this book that says the epistemology of the Witigo disease is that no one is immune, and that often those that try to fight the Witigo succumb to the Witigo themselves. And so we have to be careful about how we are uplifting and romanticizing all Indigenous peoples as pure and with all of the knowledge systems, because colonization has done a really good job of trying to assimilate our people into their systems and believe that colonial systems are our salvation through brainwashing and tactics of trying to indoctrinate us into the Witigo disease. And so we have to really work within our own communities. And this is why this project is so important to me. Like, my goal is to work with our communities, to empower our communities so that we don't become victim to this co-optation, as well as this integration into colonial systems as our salvation, but rather seeing our systems, our knowledge, our knowledges, our rights as the frameworks for building something new.
Thank you for that, Eriel. And now I'll go to Glenn Walker.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Eriel, for this wonderful Zoom meeting. I know that it said it was recorded, and I'm wondering whether or not we can, at least the people who are here, can get a copy of the link to the recording, and to also get the slides that you presented, which were wonderful. But on my small phone, I couldn't expand and read them all quickly enough.
A quick response to that. Yes, we will be putting the whole thing up on YouTube as soon as we've got the processing done, and we'll send a link to everyone who registered for this. It was 150 people who registered, so they'll all get the link. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
Welcome. I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. Sheena McMahon?
Yes, that's right. Well done. Thank you for not saying Sheenag like so many people do. Anyway, Eriel, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And thank you for the work that you are doing on behalf of everyone and every living thing on planet Earth. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to highlight a couple of things that I recommend that we always make note of and talk about, is the fact that in all the treaties, and I certainly know that in Canada, no treaty has ever been upheld. And I suspect it's the same in other colonized countries as well. But when territory was acknowledged as First Nations, the settlers meant the surface. They did not mean underneath, because I don't know how many of the people listening, but you can literally go anywhere in, quote, Canada and sink an exploration hole for minerals. That is allowed anywhere. And then frankly, you are also allowed to exploit those minerals. I've always said, wouldn't it be fun to go up to Parliament Hill and sink a test hole and go, hey, we can do it anywhere. But in fact, that's Algonquin territory because it's unceded land. So I wouldn't do that because it doesn't belong to me as a settler Canadian. So that was one thing that I thought should be highlighted. And you know what? I've forgotten what the other thing was. Oh, yes. I'm a teacher, and I always say the way to affect change is to educate the kids, because the kids will then bug the parents into making that change. When I was a teenager in the 70s, there was a huge push to stop cleaners that contained, I can't remember what they contain. I think it was phosphates, perhaps. Anyway, Mr. Clean was one of the products. And I remember a drama group coming to my school, and we all went home and said, Mom, stop, because I'm afraid in those days it was the women that did all the cleaning. We still mostly do, but men are getting better. Said, Mom, stop buying Mr. Clean. It's really bad for the planet. And within a few months, Mr. Clean had actually removed the dangerous ingredient from Mr. Clean. So the way to affect change is to get to the children. And I'll be doing that on Saanich Earth Day, where I will be running a whole bunch of games for kids and parents on what products not to buy, big maps of the world showing how far it takes, how far away China is if you're going to buy something from China instead of buying it from next door. So just fun, games like that, drama, that really, really works. And Eriel, I will volunteer my time to help you in any education project you would like to do. And I know every single curriculum in Canada.
Well, thank you so much for all of that. I think I just want to sort of respond to the mineral rights piece. I think that there's ongoing discussions around interpretation of treaty. And while the colonists and the crown that negotiated the treaties didn't quite state that they talked about to the depth of a plow in the treaty. And that's because at the time there was no actual interest in the mineral rights of the Lansing area. They had no idea. And so they utilized the lack of information or language in the treaties to circumvent engaging with Indigenous peoples on those subsurface mineral rights. And it's actually a violation because those were never negotiated. And to say that it wasn't included in the treaty, therefore it's not negotiated and it belongs to the crown, is really problematic and continues to be a long, drawn out, contentious piece between all Indigenous communities in Canada, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so again, there's big challenges around language barriers, all sorts of things that happen during treaty processes. There's some really great books on they have documented very well negotiated treaty processes, the number of treaties that are available publicly, where anyone can read all about how those negotiations unfolded. And it's a very, very, very interesting story if you actually get into it.
I remembered what the other thing I wanted to mention was that we also need to shift our focus as settler governments, and I call myself a settler Canadian, in that we need to engage with the First Peoples in their own governance systems. So the Canadian government would only deal with elected chiefs, and sometimes that's problematic in regards to the climate, because if you have to get elected, which also means you have to provide jobs for your people, there can be some conflict there. Whereas as opposed to engaging with inherited chiefs, I'm sorry, I can't remember the term at the moment. I know that the French government would not engage with the Mohawk women, who were in fact the top chiefs of the Mohawk Nation, because they wouldn't engage with women. as in power. They just could not, they didn't acknowledge it at all. So as well as engaging with First Nations governments, we also need to focus on getting away with, we will deal with your elected representatives.
Yeah, I think that this is part of the issues around how the current structures for Indigenous Indian governments in Canada is really defined by the parameters of colonial systems. They don't acknowledge the sovereignty and self-determination as outlined in UNDRIP. I think I also need to say one thing before this wraps up. I talked about UNDRIP a couple times, and I really want to state that Canada has failed to uphold UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is a serious problem because the UN Dec on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the bare minimum standards. Right now, they're negotiating legislation for the implementation of UNDRIP into Canadian legislation, where they've watered down FPIC to the C of consent to consultation. And they are struggling to implement UNDRIP into Canadian legislation, and it's the bare minimum standard, and they're treating it like the gold star. It is not the gold star. UNDRIP is not it's not the ceiling that we're supposed to be achieving. It allows us to create platforms to implement Indigenous rights, including how we define our governments by our own terms, not by the terms that are prescribed to us by colonial systems. Indigenous peoples still remain under the paternalistic rule and under legislation that is inherently racist, not just in Canada, but globally. There are countries and people that I am working with on this global council that don't even want to participate because they cannot call themselves Indigenous without fear of persecution and risk to their safety and security as a human being, meaning that they have risks to their lives just by trying to define themselves as Indigenous peoples. We live in a world where Indigenous peoples are vilified because we are seen as impediments to progress for colonial and economic power. And so I think that UNDRIP becomes so important, and we cannot treat it as the gold star or the North Star that we're trying to achieve. It is a bare minimum, and Canada has failed to meet that. And our treaties do nothing to meet the bare minimum standards of what is internationally regarded as the acceptance of upholding Indigenous people's rights.
Okay. I'd just like to jump in because we've gone beyond 10 minutes beyond that time, but I'd like to throw it to Rob because I think he has one question, and then we have to call it a day.
Great presentation, Eriel. I was an activist with your mom 20 years ago. She looked good in that picture at the back of the truck. So when I looked at the people today, watching your presentation, I see that a large majority were non-Indigenous. So my question is, how do we play a role in helping you along your journey?
That's a very good question. I am really grateful for that. I think that some of it is that particularly in settler society, within social justice movements and in the climate movement, there's really a recognition of Indigenous peoples and trying to create space for them, like this forum. But we haven't really quite gotten to the point of what it means to decolonize our spaces. We're really in the infancy of indigenizing, and indigenization is really important. But it falls kind of in that like DEI sort of framework of like just bringing people into this, being like, oh, we have a table, come sit at our table. Yeah. And I frame this in this way of like, think of it like this. Here's two very distinct groups. I'm just going to do Indigenous and settler. We can expand this to other things. We have Indigenous movements, we have settler society, and for the last 500 years, settler society has been building up their island. They're building all of the infrastructure, all of the systems, governments, economies, and Indigenous peoples over here are just like, we still exist. And like, yeah. Also, can we borrow some of this stuff? And if you don't want to give it, we're just going to take it. And they keep taking from this other island. Let's call it an island. And now we're at a point where people are like, oh, we've really screwed them over. We need to do something. But instead of actively dismantling these systems and redistributing resources to create equity, they're saying, come over here, come build our infrastructure because it's so solid and it's so great and it served us so well. So abandon your land and come and join and be amalgamated into our processes. That is what indigenizing those spaces is. That is not decolonization. And if we want really good allies, we have to be confronted with what does decolonization mean? That deconstruction of existing systems, the redevelopment and redistribution of those resources, whether those are financial, human, land, physical, and how do we build equity between two distinct groups or multiple distinct groups to ensure that there's a justice framework. And it's not about just putting another chair at the table. It's about saying, is this table actually the right table? It's about asking ourselves the hard questions about how much privilege have I had that I have not yielded in a way to create justice and equity. And equity is also not, it's not the ceiling, that's the beginning. Because once you get to the equity piece and we can all sit as equals in spaces, then we can start building up with those frameworks for solutions that address the needs of all people in the room. And I really empower people to understand history, real history. I encourage people to develop real relationships, not just attending seminars and reading the books, because we all exist on Indigenous lands and territories. Nativelands.ca is an incredible website where you can find out which territories you exist on globally. And we can find out like how to repair those relationships with our kin, our other human relatives, and the natural world. And really make sure that you're checking yourself on, am I co-opting? Am I speaking on behalf of someone else? And if you are, what can I do to address that and remediate that? And how do I do it in a way that's not tokenistic and romanticized, but is based out of true recognition of redistribution of power and resources? We are really good at indigenizing spaces. We need to get better at decolonizing them.
Thank you.
Wow. And I think we want to end on that extremely beautiful note, Eriel. Masi Cho, Tansi, Megwitch. I don't know, my heart is just bursting, but we do have to end the session now. And thank you for being such a great host and for being such a great audience and participants. We've just enjoyed all your questions and the knowledge that it's given us, as well as, just the presenters of this Lunch and Learn. I'd like to just ask you to stay on for just a few minutes so that my colleague, Catherine, who's our team lead of the Indigenous Engagement team, can run you through a few things that are going to come up in the future. And then collectively, we'll say thank you to Eriel, because I have some more Indigenous thank you words to say. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.
I just wanted to quickly thank everybody for being here today. And in particular, thanks to you, Eriel, for what a wonderful presentation. I can't wait to actually view it again when the video becomes available, because I just want to absorb it more fully. For those of you who have hung out here with us until the bitter end, I wanted to call your attention to the fact that we have linked the website, the WeCan website, in the chat. We are also a nonprofit organization that relies on donations to support our very tiny budget. And if you're able to make a donation, I've placed a donation link in the chat as well. And finally, if you are not already subscribing to our newsletter, I recommend it strongly. It's coming out every weekend, usually on Saturday morning, and it's just chock full of climate news, climate jobs, climate actions that you can take. And I look at it myself every week. It's too much for any one human being to read, so don't feel like you have to read the whole thing, but scan through it and pay attention to the things that really draw your interest. That's it. I'm gonna say Marcy and Nanes Losa, and I probably pronounced all of those wrong, but thank you for being with us, Eriel.
So let's do one more thing. If you put your view onto gallery so you can see everyone, and turn on your cameras, let's all send a collective, heartfelt thanks and good luck. You use your react buttons with all sorts of fun, to play around with stuff, and just unmute yourself and call out whatever you want to Eriel to wish her Godspeed and good luck on her wonderful new journey, right? Feel free to yell out.
My hands. to that's all.
Wonderful. Best present
Hey, thank
ever.
you.
Thanks, Eriel.
Masi Cho, thank you.
I won't wish you Godspeed because I'm an
Ariel,
atheist.
let me show you one other thing we do in WeCan. We hold up, we can form a circle even on Zoom. If you hold your hand up so that half your hand is on your screen and the other half on the other side, you're now holding hands with the person next to you. This is our circle of love.
Oh, it's so cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye, folks.